So let's talk about the science of candidate selection. I must admit that this is an issue dear to my heart. I own a company which is involved in executive recruitment, and what we've tried to do is to build an offering based on science, based on research as to what causes people to succeed and fail at work. And to talk about the concept of science, I mean, when we use the term science, people must wonder, well, what exactly does that mean? The science is simply as follows. In literally hundreds of experiments over decades now, people have assessed people on a range of different characteristics. Now, those things could have been their performance at interviews, it could have been their CVs, it could have been their zodiac signs, that's been done, their eye colour, their physical height, it could be reference checks, it could be whatever. And people's results have been retained before they get hired. And then you have people being hired, and then a year later, 2 years later sometimes, what you'll do is you'll go back and gather up success and failure information on those people who've been hired. And what you then do is you mathematically link the results of their success data back to the data that was gathered through the various prediction methods that we used. And so you're talking about assessing recruitment methods based on a thing called predictive validity. What is it that predicts success and what is it that predicts failure? Historically, the emphasis has been very much on the prediction of success. You recruit a salesperson, do they sell? You recruit somebody who's meant to create a certain quality of work. You get a supervisor rating as to whether that quality of work has been delivered. One of the things that's been a really important breakthrough, particularly in the past 5 years in this science, has been a much greater emphasis on the measure of failure. Failure in terms of things like counterproductive work behaviours. And what we mean by that is once we've hired these people, we look back at what was used to predict whether they would succeed or fail, and then we look at data such as whether they have stolen things, whether they've bullied colleagues, whether they've taken sick days when they're not really sick, those kind of things. Now, those sorts of things, of course, are crucial because when people recruit, they're trying to do two things. They're trying to identify characteristics that give them confidence that the person can do the job. But of course, they're also trying to protect their corporate culture by not importing negative characteristics. Now, we have summarised this data in a thing that we call the league ladder of recruitment predictiveness. And the league ladder of recruitment predictiveness is a summary of research which has been undertaken over the years. You'll see the reference at the bottom of the table. And what we do is that as new research comes along, we simply update this league ladder to make sure that our clients are informed with the most useful pieces of information to help them predict both success and failure of prospective employees. Let's go to the bottom of the table first and let's see the things that don't predict success. Now, at the very bottom of the table, you'll see age, and you'll see a number beside it. That number is very close to 0, and that number is a correlation coefficient. And this is the way that we mathematically assess whether the method turns out to be predictive of success or failure at work. And you'll see that age has a very small correlation. Personally, I take great comfort in that. I'm getting on. It turns out that age is a very poor predictor of success at work. Now, above this, you'll see once more with a very small correlation is a thing called graphology. And I'm often asked, what is graphology? Graphology is handwriting analysis. And before I came to SACS Consulting, this would be about 14, 15 years ago, I lived and worked in the United Kingdom and I undertook a number of searches in Paris. And in Paris, in those days, and I understand it's still the case, people rely very heavily on the opinions of graphologists. And if you go up and down the Champs-Élysées, you will see graphologists sitting in offices with a pile of papers on one side, and they write reports on what these papers mean. And they will tell you things like, this is a person of high integrity, this is a person who can be trusted under pressure. Unfortunately, you see the correlation is very close to 0 and it doesn't happen to be true. Now, the next one's a little scary for some clients because it relates to years of education. And it turns out that years of education is once more an extremely poor predictor of success at work. So whether a person has a PhD or a base degree has an extremely weak correlation with whether the person succeeds or not. I'm not saying don't recruit people who are more educated. If that's your preference, feel free to do so. Just don't expect those people to be better employees than people who have the basic level of education that's necessary to do the job. The next level up is interests, and once more we see a very, very small correlation. People's interests have very little to do with whether people are likely to succeed or fail at work. And we know that there are people who like to ask people, what do you like to do outside of your work hours? And because perhaps they're trying to find out things about people's personalities, let's say. But actually, you're using a measure which is a proxy for something rather than using the direct measure itself. We would suggest assess personality directly. And what that should allow you to do is to identify not something that suggests that they might be, say, a sociable person or a person who cares about the community, but assess it directly. The next one up, again with a very weak correlation, is a thing called years of job experience. And this, for many clients, is a very scary thought because we see clients all the time that prefer a candidate that has 10 years experience versus 5 years experience. Now, I think one of the questions that you have to ask when you make that preference is, does this person genuinely have 10 years experience? Because some people have 1 year experience 10 times over. In any event, it turns out that the person who has 5 years experience can't be assumed to be a worse candidate than the candidate who has 10 years experience because the correlation between years of job experience and success is very weak indeed. The next one up, once more, is a shock for many recruiters: references. And you'll see that what we have there is a correlation of 0.26. We see many organisations which rely incredibly heavily on reference checks, but reference checks are quantifiably inaccurate. Now you see that 0.26, that's not a percentage, but it can easily be converted into a percentage. And the way that you convert it into a percentage is to simply take that 0.26 and square it. And if you do that, it comes out to around about 0.07, and that means 7% accuracy. How accurate are reference checks? 7% accurate. Another way to look at that is 93% wrong. Now, I'm not suggesting don't do reference checks. It's useful to do reference checks, and sometimes, although rarely, they do give you valuable information. But what we're suggesting is that you should incline your attention towards the thing at the top of the table. There are certain things that are much more predictive of success at work. So if we move to the top of the table, you see, firstly, a combination of cognitive ability testing with a thing called integrity testing is a very powerful combination. Let's just talk about cognitive ability for a moment. It turns out that for most jobs, people who are more intelligent, who have a higher level of ability to be able to deal with issues, are much more successful. That's a finding that we've known for many years, and you'll see at the top of the table you get a correlation of 0.51 out of cognitive ability alone. Smart candidates do better than candidates who are not so smart. Now, people might think that this applies only to senior roles, but in fact it applies to roles that are even quite junior. So if you rank your best street sweepers, it turns out that the best street sweepers are, on average, if you combine the results of many hundreds of street sweepers, the ones who are a little bit smarter do better than the ones who are not so smart. Now, I'm not saying that you should have the levels of IQ that you're looking for in chief executives in amongst your street sweepers, but still, there's a relationship. Intelligence gives you 4 things. It gives you speed. People who are more intelligent tend to be able to do things more quickly. It gives you the power to crack problems, and that's really important. It gives you a thing called trainability, which is the ability to learn things quickly. And the final thing that it gives you is a thing called absence of counterproductive work behaviours, or if not an absence, at least a reduction in counterproductive work behaviours. Research, particularly over the past 2 to 3 years, has found that work groups with lower levels of intelligence tend to be much more likely to do bad things, like bullying, harassment, theft, etc. And it seems that there's a biological explanation to this, and that is that people who have lower IQs seem much less able to fight down the natural biological urges that they have. So if they get angry, maybe they're a little bit more likely to do something about it than if they have a higher IQ, which causes them to see the potential implications of their actions. So intelligence matters. Another thing that matters enormously is the person's integrity. And for some organisations, it shocks people that integrity, trustworthiness, the absence of counterproductive work behaviours can be measured. Well, it can be measured, and at SACS we've undertaken 2 or 3 very significant pieces of research into the links between personality and values and counterproductive work behaviours. And we've developed a methodology that allows us to predict the risk of an individual conducting counterproductive work behaviours with 45% accuracy. Now, 45% accuracy is incredibly high for anything to do in the human resources space, and we consider this to be very important research, and we are offering that to our clients through our psychological assessment practice. And we'll be speaking in another video more about how exactly we do psychological assessment. So you've got intelligence and you've got integrity, then you have personality. Now, we use the Hexaco model of personality. Hexaco model of personality was derived in 2005 and 2006 by Kibiam Lee and Mike Ashton in Canada. And the Hexaco model of personality has one very significant breakthrough. They added a factor of personality which was hitherto not used in most places, and that's a thing called honesty, humility. And it turns out that it's a really good idea to recruit people who are honest, truthful, trustworthy, and not arrogant. And in fact, one of the things that Kibiam Lee and Mike Ashton found in their research is that there's a link between honesty, trustworthiness, and arrogance. And it turns out that people who are arrogant have almost a dispositional difficulty in being truthful and honest. It's almost as though the rules don't apply to them. So with the addition of that honesty, humility factor to personality, the Hexaco model of personality is a much better predictor of failure at work than previous models of personality, whilst retaining the characteristics of being a good predictor of success at work. Other characteristics in personality that matter: emotionality. For most jobs, candidates who are emotionally stable are better than candidates who are emotionally unstable. For obvious reasons, you want people who can cope with stress. In addition, we measure agreeableness. And agreeableness is the degree to which people are easy to approach, friendly, warm, or angry and difficult. And for virtually any job that you can think of, it's better for people to be warm, approachable, and not angry. Then there's a thing called conscientiousness. And for most jobs, it's very important for candidates to bring a sense of purpose, to bring a sense of commitment, to bring a sense of energy. And that has been found for decades to be a good predictor of success at work. But we also know that if you look at counterproductive work behaviours, people who undertake counterproductive work behaviours against an organisation, such as saying bad things about the organisation, not turning up to work when they're not really sick, things like theft, people who have low conscientiousness scores tend to do those things more often. And finally, you have the characteristic of values. Now, we use the Schwartz Personal Values Questionnaire. Shalom Schwartz is one of the leaders in the world in research into values, and he developed assessments for values at two levels. At a cultural level, and one of the things that I often speak to at conferences is that I show people a map of the world identified in its various values categories. It's a fascinating piece of work, and it relates to the next category of work that Shalom was able to identify, which is that people have personal values. And there are 10 personal values that seem to be very important for people's culture fit at work. Because, of course, the value set of individuals and the value set of groups that they belong to is a very significant determinant of whether people are likely to feel comfortable in a certain work group and whether they're likely to be able to be accepted readily into that work group. So we assess all of these things in the practice of our recruitment method. Now, in executive search, what we also do is that we use the most advanced behavioural interviewing techniques. Behavioural interviewing is considered in a range of different ways by a range of different organisations, but what you're really doing is that you're tracking down critical incidents in the person's life to date, and you're identifying how those critical incidents, those big events in their life, relate to their capacity to be able to perform the competencies that you're going to need from a work point of view. And in our executive search services, what we're doing is that we're providing people with the capacity to evaluate that by showing the clients before we start the recruitment process what questions we're going to be asking, and then in our candidate reports, we're literally showing them the responses that these candidates gave in respect of those behavioural interviewing questions. Now, you'll see that behavioural interviewing, what's called structural interviews, and the league ladder of recruitment predictiveness come out to about 0.51, which is highly valid. Now, we believe that if you use the science of candidate evaluation techniques in totality, we believe that you should be getting up to predictiveness of 0.7 to 0.75. Most people out in the world today rely on methods that will give them around about 0.35 to 0.4. I think that's what you call a competitive advantage.